Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, Steven Osuna returns to the podcast. Steven Osuna is an associate professor of sociology at CSU Long Beach. He has written extensively on street organizations, policing, the so-called war on drugs, and the ravages of capitalism and neoliberalism. He also has experience organizing in the Philippine solidarity movement and other struggles. Before I go further, I want to give a shout out and send solidarity to all of the Cal State University faculty, as I know they have been on rolling strikes and are negotiating their new contracts currently. In this conversation, Osuna talks to us about Mao's speech and essay on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. This is part of our series of episodes with guests where they pick a piece of communist, socialist, or other radical thought, and we read it as well, and we come together and we talk about it. This conversation was recorded back in August, so you won't hear references to the current struggle in Palestine or other current events, but nonetheless, this conversation is as relevant as always to organizing among the people, and so it is relevant to the struggle today. Thanks again to Steven Osuna for this conversation. We'll include links in the show notes to the Philippine solidarity campaigns he uplifts at the end, as well as the Foreign Languages Press website and their new journal material. Also, as we mentioned last time, we do have a Sylvia Winter study group coming up. This is for patrons or YouTube members. It will be Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern during the month of January. You can find out more about that on our Patreon. You can become a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month and support our work at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism.
Steven, welcome back. So we just put out a recent conversation on the show, and you've been on here more than once, I think, right? So this is probably your third time, I think. So just remind folks briefly of who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks y'all for having me. I really appreciate being on this show. Currently, my primary role is spending as much time as I can taking care of my 2-year-old son. So shout out to him. But I'm an associate professor of sociology at Cal State Long Beach. I did my PhD in sociology with an emphasis in Black studies and had the honor to work with important intellectuals in Santa Barbara. I was born and raised and displaced from the Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. That's where I would say my political consciousness began. I was raised by a single mom who worked as a domestic worker, and that really shaped my working class outlook to this day, and especially in this petty bourgeois job of academia. In Los Angeles, I've been part of different grassroots formations emerging from the Salvadoran left. I've been part of accompanying Central American refugees, and more recently, I've been active in solidarity with the People's Democratic Movement in the Philippines. These are the spaces that have really shaped my reading of Marxism and communist thought, right? So, I've done the academic aspect of being an academic and learning about Marxism in that route, but I really think that participating in organizing and organization has shaped how I understand Marxism in the practical aspect of it. Right? So I'm looking forward to this discussion today.
Awesome. Yes. Before we get into some of the sections of this essay, could you just say a little bit about why you selected this essay? What is its importance for you?
Well, I think first of all, I think reading Mao is timely, as always. I think the thoughts and writings and perspectives that Mao offers in his perspective of the Chinese Revolution and his active participation in waging revolution is important. I think in this political current conjuncture, his ideas are as important as ever. Mao, like your previous guest discussed about Stalin, is oftentimes very demonized in this country. So even on the left, people oftentimes don't think of reading Mao or see you reading Mao as someone that's your, ultra leftist or something. But I think Mao has a lot to offer. And even if you look at movements across the world right now, there's Maoist movements engaging in struggle. I think there's a lot to learn from them. So I think this essay specifically, as the title states, right, I think it's important for us who are doing solidarity work or are part of political organizations or support political organizations or just on the ground serving people. I think we have to work through contradictions, and learning about the contradictions amongst the people is important, right? And to distinguish between contradictions among the people and the contradictions that we have with the enemy, because we do have enemies, right? And, how do we do principled organizing through contradictory conditions, scenarios, and working with broad sectors of society? I think this essay really provides, it's a historical essay, but it provides lessons on how to work through that, right? And I just ended my summer modern sociological theory class that I teach in the summer. And I ended with a quote from Mao. And I had a student come up to me after and was like, do people know you teach Mao? And it's like, even that, right? The reflection of that moment, right? It was like, well, yeah, why not? It's important for us to read them. But the quote that I left my students with was from the role of the Chinese Communist Party in the National War. And the quote is, complacency is the enemy of study. We cannot really learn anything until we rid ourselves of complacency. Our attitude towards ourselves should be, quote, to be insatiable in learning, and towards others to be tireless in teaching. And for me, that was an important quote to lead the students off with. And I think it's an important quote to get us going today.
Yeah, thank you.
So Marxist.org tells us that this piece was initially presented as a speech in February of 1957, and then slightly revised before being published in the People's Daily in June of the same year. So can you share anything about that context of this piece before we get into it? What were some of the things going on in Chinese society that Mao was looking to address at the time?
Yeah, so, in 1957, that's 8 years since the triumph of the Chinese Revolution, right? So that's 8 years of constructing, socialism, or attempting to construct socialism, right? So I think Mao in this essay is addressing one of his important contributions to Marxist theory, right? And practice. That class struggle and the contradiction it produces continues during socialist construction, right? That it doesn't end when the revolution triumphs, that there will be contradictions through the road of building socialism. And I think in this essay, that's what he's trying to work through, right? This is like, again, 8 years, and they're like, okay, what are the contradictions that are emerging under socialist reconstruction? And trying to remind his comrades, right, that this is what we're working through, right? Because remember, a lot of the stuff that Mao writes is writing towards his comrades. He's writing towards the members of the Communist Party, and how do we address issues? How do we assess the problems that we're seeing in our society? So I think that's important to read it in that context, right? He's writing in a moment where it's trying to think about how are we developing a state-planned economy? How are we changing the relations of production, constructing the forces of production, right? And, within the Communist Party, there were struggles. There was two-line struggles about that. Like, do we take the socialist road or the capitalist road? And there was reformers, even within the beginning, that were trying to say, no, we should take this route that's more capitalist-oriented, right? While others were saying, no, we need to take the socialist route. So even then, there was those what they call two-line struggles happening within the Communist Party. And here Mao is addressing this point, right? How do we deal with the contradictions amongst the people in this socialist construction? And think about between this period, we already had issues of land reform, the developments of co-ops. A year later, in 1958, would be the development of communes, right? And around this time, you also had, the beginning of the great debates, right? Which eventually would lead to the Sino-Soviet split between Russia and the Soviet Union and China, right? But this is prior to that. This is like initially, because remember, Stalin dies in 1953, but you start to see the different view of how world socialist revolution will take place, right? And there's this division between the Soviet Union and China, right? So all this is happening around this time that he writes this, right? But I think, this essay, it provides us important lessons on organization and organizing amongst the masses for our own ideological development and in practicing dialectical materialism. Because dialectical materialism is not just to understand the world, but to change it. And that means changing ourselves and our own world outlets. And I think that's what Mao's working through in this essay and different parts of it. And for us in this current moment, what are the contradictions we face as grassroots organizers, organizations, when we're dealing with nonprofits, for example? What are the contradictions that we're going to confront when we're grassroots, but we have to engage a nonprofit or members of a nonprofit, right? Or we're engaging another organization with a different political line as well, right? Or with communities who might believe that police defend them, protect them, right? How do we engage those contradictions that we're up against? I think those are important lessons that we might learn from this essay, right? And how, working through the contradictions, and I keep saying contradiction, but this is what this essay is about, right? Through the everyday experiences of our lives and our communities and ourselves.
Right on. One quick question, just kind of follow up on that, is like, this comes after On Practice and On Contradiction, right? So do you see these three as kind of three parts of a whole, or how do you think about this one in relation to those two pieces?
Well, this one comes much later than On Practice and Contradiction, right? Because On Practice and On Contradiction comes about before the actual revolution triumphs, right? But I think those two, this is actually like a practical from those two, right? Because those two, he's assessing what's happening during the revolutionary process, but this one is post, this is during socialist construction, right? But I think for those listeners that they haven't read On Contradiction and On Practice, definitely read those two before you read this one, right? Because I think those are a lot of more of the philosophical, right? That gets us to understand what he's referring to, what he's referring to with contradiction, right? And for Marxism, contradiction is an important analysis, right? In the Marxist method.
Yeah, appreciate that. So one of the things that Mao lays out is that these groups, the enemy and the people, shift. So, he talks about these two groups, the enemy and the people, and that they shift based on circumstances. For instance, he lays out how different forces and actors comprise the people or the enemy, prior or during the revolution, and then they shift and different individuals and forces become the enemy or the people after the revolution. So can you talk a little bit about this shift and how Mao described the two periods and the key distinctions between them when thinking about these? Yeah,
no, definitely. I think listening to your question, I was also want to remind myself about how many different organizations in this country historically have applied Mao's lessons, right? Especially these lessons about the people and the enemy. I think about how we serve the people. You think about the Black Panther Party and some of the other organizations that are really implemented the lessons of Mao and the Chinese Revolution, right? But, in this sense, this question, I think about, again, returning to the point that Mao really wanted him and his comrades to understand and be clear on who is the enemy and who is the people under this construction. And in this, he's addressing that, the enemy and the people change depending on the political and historical conjuncture, right? And so I think in this essay, there's 12 subheadings, right, of the essay. And he breaks down these 12 subheadings. Obviously, the main one being about the contradictions amongst the people. But the very first one, which is two different types of contradictions, address the question that you're asking, right? So in this essay, Mao states, quote, led by the working class and the Communist Party, our 600 million people, united as one, are engaged in the great task of building socialism. I think that, he sets it up right there, right? This idea that, the Communist Party, the working class, and 600 million people are in this view at this moment, 7-8 years later, there's a unity in that we're building socialism in China, right? But yet within this unity, contradictions exist. Right? And how do we address these contradictions? So in this task of building socialism, he argues that the Communist Party and the working class are confronted by two types of contradictions, which one being the People's Republic of China and their enemy, and those amongst the people of the PRC. But to understand these different types of contradictions correctly, Mao argued that they had to be clear between what is meant by the people and by the enemy. He says that those social forces under these categories change depending on the historical and political conjuncture, as I mentioned, right? So he gives examples, right? He says, for example, during the China's war of resistance against Japan, he says, during this time, all the classes, stratas, and social groups opposing Japanese aggression came within the category of the people. Right? Now, that's very broad. So it just pretty much anyone that was against Japanese aggression was the people. And the enemy were the Japanese imperialists, the Chinese traders, and pro-Japanese elements were then that sector of the enemy. During Chinese War of Liberation, the revolution, the enemy was U.S. imperialism, U.S. Chinese bureaucrat capitalists, the landlords, and the Kuomintang, or the nationalist party. That those were the enemy. And while the other classes, strata, and social groups opposing them all came within the category, Communist Party, the working class, peasantry, right? In 1957, when this essay was written and socialism was being constructed, for Mao, the classes, strata, and social groups which favor, support, and work for the cause of socialist construction all came within the category of the people. And while the social forces and groups which resisted the socialist revolution and were hostile or tried to sabotage socialist construction were what he would see within the enemies of the people. Right? I think for me in this essay, Mao is describing his analysis of building socialism in a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society, right? So this idea of a united front, right, against Japanese imperialism, against U.S. imperialism, right, and the development of socialism. So he's talking about all these different contradictions. And in this discussion, and I know we'll get into it more, but he's talking about the contradictions between the people and to the enemy, and how the contradiction amongst the enemy is an antagonistic, while the contradiction amongst the people is a non-antagonistic. Right? And he goes into different, what are the different contradictions that we see amongst the people, right? And he describes many of them, right? He says there's contradictions among the people are contradictions within the working class, contradictions within the peasantry, contradictions within the intelligentsia, contradictions between the working class and the peasantry, the contradiction between the workers and the peasants on the one hand, and intellectuals on the other, right? He goes into discussion the contradiction between the working class and other sections of the working people on the one hand, and the national bourgeoisie on the other, right? The contradiction in the national bourgeoisie and so on. He even talks about that the people's government is genuinely represent the people's interests, but there's still going to be a contradiction between the people's government and the people, right? That there will be contradictions there that have to be managed, right? And he finishes off in that section talking about, the contradiction of the Chinese bourgeoisie, right? The national bourgeoisie. Look, during revolution, they have a dual character. During the bourgeois democratic part of the revolution, they had a dual character. They were either supportive of the revolution, or they had a kind of a conciliatory process towards the enemy character, right? And during the socialist revolution, during that period that this is being written, they still serve a dual character, right? Because they're still exploiting the working class because they're still bourgeoisie. But on the other side, their willingness to accept socialist transformation, right? So there is this contradiction there, that they were accepting the transformation of Chinese society into a socialist society, yet they were at the same time exploiting the workers, right? So there is that contradiction that had to be worked through. But for him, it was a non-antagonistic one because they were on the road of supporting socialist development. So again, this thing about describing, well, who are the enemies and who are the people was important for Mao in this period. And I think even for us that are studying, in our organizing, work, to see, well, who are the people that are the enemy of the work we're doing, right? Who are the people that we're serving? Who are the people that are on our side, right? And this applies so much.
Absolutely. So this piece is really famous for breaking down the difference between antagonistic contradictions and non-antagonistic contradictions, or contradictions among the people, as opposed to contradictions between the enemy and the people. So how does Mao suggest that we seek to determine which is which, and what are some ways we might respond to non-antagonistic contradictions that might be different than the antagonistic ones?
Yeah, so again, as Jay mentioned, right, I think definitely we should, before we get into reading this piece, definitely read on contradiction, right? Because there he goes into detail about what he means by a non-antagonistic and antagonistic contradiction. But in this one, again, I think what he's trying to do is trying to draw that distinction between the contradiction amongst friends or the people, right? The people that you're working with, and the contradiction amongst the people and the enemy. And that these two different contradictions, one of them is being non-antagonistic, that could be worked through, it could be struggled through. And the other one is a confrontation. The other one is definitely an antagonistic. And so drawing that distinction, I think, is an important aspect of this piece, right? Where he's trying to get this idea of drawing the fine line, right? Between this is the line between the enemy and people. And I want to quote a passage here from the reading. Is it, our state is a people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class and based on the worker-peasant alliance. What is this dictatorship for? Its first function is internal, namely to suppress the reactionary classes and elements and those exploiters who resist the socialist revolution, to suppress those who try to wreck our socialist construction, or in other words, to resolve the contradiction between ourselves and the eternal enemy. So again, the term that dictatorship might throw some of us off, right? Because we usually hear that dictatorship, but we think of an individual. But here, the Marxist terminology, when we think of dictatorship, for example, we live in a bourgeois dictatorship. The interests of this society, the interests of the bourgeois, the capitalist class, right? And here he's referring to that the dictatorship is the people's dictatorship under this revolution, right? And so that the dictatorship of this revolution is to quell counter-revolution, to prevent attacks by the enemy, right? And he continues, right? Our dictatorship is the people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class and based on the worker-peasant alliance. Under this system, the people enjoy broad democracy and freedom, but at the same time, they have to keep with the bounds of socialist discipline. So he's trying to make this distinction about, look, the people's dictatorship uses the state to stop counter-revolution, to prevent international imperialists to come after us, right? But within this dictatorship, it serves the interests of the people. And he continues, when dealing with the contradictions among people, which he defines as non-antagonistic, he argues, well, the only way to settle questions of an ideological nature or controversial issue among the people is by the democratic method, the method of discussion, criticism, persuasion, and education, and not by the method of coercion and repression. And I think, he's trying to make that distinction, right? That a non-antagonistic contradiction has to be done through methods of discussion, criticism, persuasion, education, right? Again, this constant discussion, this constant meeting people where they're at, trying to work through these ideas together collectively versus the idea of coercion and repression that under the people's democratic dictatorship, that was more towards the enemy, right? That you would use coercion and repression towards those that are trying to prevent socialist construction, right? So I think, working through those non-antagonist and antagonist contradiction is what this piece is offering for us in this section, right? And for us in our context, I think political education, principle discussion, and debate between organization, mass-based organizing, where you meet people and struggle through dominant ideas of society is what this is trying to get us to think about, right? I think, in my own work, I think of the idea of like working with students or people that I meet on when I'm doing organizing and the importance of political education, right? When you're trying to organize, you're not coercing people to believe something. You're not trying to push or coerce people to follow or sign a petition or attend an event or go to a rally. You're doing political education. Trying to persuade and trying to convince people of the problems of the world, right? And so you're not doing this through a coercive or repressive lens, and I think that's something that's non-antagonistic versus antagonistic. But I'd love to hear what y'all think when you're reading this piece. What do y'all think when seeing this section and stuff?
I think that's right. I guess one of the questions is like, does he see antagonistic contradictions among the people as well? Or does the presence of an antagonistic contradiction automatically put someone in the category of the enemy, right?
Yeah, I would think that, right? I think because I would say that because in the reading he mentions that, right? That if we don't deal with the non-antagonistic contradiction amongst people, that they could become antagonistic, right? And then if they become antagonistic, meaning against socialist construction, right? Then we have a problem. But we could deal with the non-antagonistic contradiction, right, through different methods. A democratic method, right? That's what he says in the piece, right? And I think, again, we see that in organizations, right? That if there's issues that arise that if dealt principally, we can handle them. But eventually, oftentimes they're not, right? And in our society that, under a capitalist society, oftentimes capitalism and capitalist ideology influence even our organizing. And when we don't think things principally and things become antagonistic, when they could have been easily non-antagonistic. And I think that's that fine line. That's the contradiction. That contradictions are a fine line that constantly have to be struggled through, and the non-antagonistic contradiction can easily become antagonistic, and vice versa. We can make an antagonistic contradiction into a non-antagonistic.
Right on. Thank you. So we're going to get into a thorny part now. And there are some in this, I will say, some interesting stuff, because he's dealing with real contradictions, right? But so one of the things that's interesting in this piece is, given the time period when it's written, it's not long after the uprisings in Hungary or the, rebellion, potential revolution, counter-revolution, whatever, which of course was the cause of many splits in the international communist movement. Just for a point of reference for folks who are not familiar with this at all, like, this is actually the origin of the term tanky, because it was a derogatory term used to those who supported the USSR, basically using military force to put down that rebellion. And, we're not here to litigate that debate and get all bogged down into it. But I do think this piece is interesting in light of that, because you can see Mao is very much reflecting on it and is dealing with, like, contradictions that show up within his own society as people sort of, like, maybe he'll say, oh, maybe those Hungarians had the right idea or whatever, So he's trying to think about how to deal and give, I think in part I read this piece as sort of trying to provide, like, resources to the party and, like, how do we deal with these contradictions among the people as best as possible without resorting to the more coercive before they get and become antagonistic. And he's quick, of course, to point out, as we all know here, that bourgeois democracy does not represent true freedom for the people, which is, I think what he's arguing that the Hungarian folks were trying to achieve, right? Or I can't remember exactly what context he says that, but it's related to it. But he also talks about the relationship between democracy and centralism and freedom and discipline, which he sees as, quote, contradictory as well as united. Which is that whole section is kind of an interesting formulation. I wanted to read a little bit of a passage here. He says, quote, in advocating freedom with leadership and democracy under centralized guidance, we in no way mean that coercive measures should be taken to settle ideological questions or questions involving the distinction between right and wrong among the people. All attempts to use administrative orders or coercive measures to settle ideological questions or questions of right and wrong are not only ineffective but harmful. we cannot abolish religion by administrative order or force of people not to believe in it. We cannot compel people to give up idealism any more than we can force them to embrace Marxism. The only way to settle questions of an ideological nature or controversial issues among the people is by democratic method, the method of discussion, criticism, persuasion, and education, and not by the method of coercion or repression. End quote. This is very much kind of what you were just laying out. So we'll get a little bit more into the method or approach to this in a minute, but I'm just curious if these sections, if you had any thoughts on this particular passage here.
Yeah, I did, because again, like you said, it's such an interesting moment that he's writing this, and like the term "tanky" just made me smile. But I think, here you have a leader of a revolution, right, of a communist party trying to build socialism in his country, and you have this rebellion in Hungary against the Soviet Union, which, remember, at this time was still working with China, right? This is before the split. Here you have, the Chinese Communist Party and Mao trying to figure out, this is happening in the Soviet Union. We have to be careful that this could happen here, because you might have folks, like you just said, that might say, well, they're fighting for certain basic liberal reforms. Maybe we should have those in China as well, right? And so, like, how does he address concerns of the Chinese people that might be, legitimate concerns without having to resort to coercion? Right, without having to resort towards repression, because it's kind of almost like building on the lessons of what happened in Hungary, right? Because this is the year after. I don't think he writes it in that way, but I think this is if you could read it that way, like, how do we learn from what happened there and not let it happen here? And I think, for example, during the last few years in Cuba, right, that one protest that happened in Cuba, and how they had to respond, and how the United States jumped on that and said, this is, these people are fighting for freedom, and some people over here were saying, oh yeah, look, there were Black Cubans doing it. That means that Cuba's anti-Black, right? They're just jumping on creating this whole counter-revolutionary idea towards Cuba. So I think having to deal with building a revolution is not a pretty thing, right? I think there's a lot of parts now talks about, revolution is not a dinner party. So again, he's dealing, like you said, with the contradictions that might emerge. And for him, again, as the educator that he is, it's like the art of persuasion. How do we persuade? How do we talk to people? How do we meet people and their concerns and build from that, rather than repress them, rather than coerce them, right? And the importance of on the ground organizing comes out in this, right? That the importance of the party being down with the people, being at the grassroots level with the people, right? Not necessarily from top down, and again, this idea of the mass line that they oftentimes refer to, right? And so you have a glimpse here of someone leading a revolution and trying to understand international situations, and Hungary being the example of that, and making sure that what was happening in Hungary doesn't influence the potential contradictions that exist within Chinese society. Because again, he recognizes that even under socialist construction, there's contradictions, right? Because of the differences of classes, because classes are not done with under socialist construction, right? There's still classes. And the building of socialism is going to have classes. And within those classes, there are contradictions. Within different sectors of the working class, the peasantry and the working class, right? As I mentioned earlier, the difference of intellectuals that might not completely, which towards the end of this conversation, I want to do it because he has a section on intellectuals, which I think speaks to the intellectuals that listen to this, right? But he's talking about them too. Like, not all of them are communists. And how do we engage these intellectuals that might have more of a liberal democratic view, right, of society? How do we engage that? And so I think those things you see in this piece, and then that passage you read, right? Again, trying to develop a method of discussion in dealing with the ideological nature of controversial issues. That oftentimes are ideological, right? And how do you get people to understand through that lens, right? The perspectives and conditions that exist. And again, it speaks to the conditions that we live on, right? When we're talking to organizing people, that people experience and face exploitation, and they know they're being exploited, but they might have a different lens to it. They might say that's just what it is. That's how it is. It's always been this way. You're not going to coerce. No, you're wrong. It's like, nah, you engage that. You engage that it's always been this way. Well, let's talk about how it's always been this way. What do you mean? You're engaging people, and I think this is what that lesson is trying to show us, right? That it's messy and it's hard work, but it has to be done at that level, right? And I think that's what he's messaging. That's what that message is being laid out here, right? That there will be differences and different perspectives emerging amongst the people. And we see that if you're an organizer, you know that. You're on the ground. You know that not everyone agrees with the political lines that we have, but you still have to engage those folks, right? That's the mass. And how do you do that is with that democratic method, which gets later into, unity, criticism, unity.
Yeah. So shifting gears, in terms of the approach to resolving conflicts among the people, Mao espouses the idiom unity, criticism, and unity, or one might say unity, struggle, unity. So how does he describe these approaches, and what are some of your thoughts on them and how to try to put them into practice?
Yeah, it's a trip to me, because I think, the word criticism or criticize in our bourgeois society is often defined as attack. That term criticism or criticize, But however, for the Chinese communists and in all leftist movements, criticism was a way of building better conditions for socialist construction. Criticism wasn't seen as something negative, right? Or like attack on your character. This was more like, how do we criticize the conditions to improve it? And so in this discussion of unity, criticism, unity, right, I think what he calls the democratic method, and I want to quote this passage here, right? He says, to elaborate, the means is starting with from the desire for unity, resolving contradictions through criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis. Or in other words, learn from past mistakes to avoid future ones, and cure the sickness to save the patient. I think to me, that idea of to start with the position of unity, we start from the position of look, we're united, now let's figure out the contradictions that we're dealing with to get better united, right? To have a better unity on a better new basis. I think that to me is really powerful, right? Because again, it's struggling through issues collectively, right? Rather than, breaking off and not talking about these things or again, going behind people's backs and not having an organization that really could air out the contradictions that are existing in the problem with the organization. And in this situation here that he's addressing, right, he's like, when there's contradiction amongst the people, not the enemy, but amongst the people, we're going to take this approach of unity, criticism, unity. And he says that it's effectively worked throughout the revolutionary process, right? And that this is something that he wants to amplify amongst Chinese society. Within the party, within the mass organizations, within people's everyday lives, he says in the article, right? That he wants everyone to deal with this even on their daily lives. And that's such a useful point to me, right? That even for our own lives, in this bourgeois society that's so difficult to deal with as comrades, right? It's like, how do you struggle through contradictions with each other, and how do you build from a position of unity, criticism, unity, even in your personal life, right? I think that, is such an important, useful tool to think through. And I know many organizations apply this, but the idea of criticism, self-criticism, this is, for example, has been very useful to me. I even think about it as an academic, right? How can I keep myself accountable to organizations? How can I self-criticize, right? And how can I be open to hearing criticism if what I'm doing is incorrect, right? Or if the perspective I'm providing might be incorrect. And if I be criticized from organizations, I should be open to that and not see that as a direct attack to me, but about the perspective and the framing that we're taking forward. I think that's an important lesson. But it's, again, in a capitalist society that's makes people very egotistical. Criticism is a direct attack rather than actually not. It's like, and, I get it, because some people do get a critique from a mean-spirited and take-down way because, again, this society has shaped us to do that. But in a society that was trying to build socialism, they were trying to implement an idea of criticizing to build, right? And again, the idea of, with that quote that, right, to cure the sickness to save the patient, right? This idea of you want to save the patient, so you cure the sickness. That's the issue that I think is important in that point of unity, criticism, unity.
Just from your own experience, because, I think taking criticism is really, like you said, I think it's hard for people in general, but especially, I think, within our society, in the way that the kind of competitive nature that we all have, and wanting to be correct, wanting to be right, wanting to be liked, all of those sort of things. Do you have any any pointers that you use for yourself, or any?
Yeah, I'll get real personal right now too. I think, I've been part of organizing spaces, and I've been in spaces where we do apply this method of criticism, right? And some aspects, it's helpful, right? You take it personal for a few minutes, and you realize this is about building the collective organization. You're right. Let's move forward, right? But in other situations, I was also disciplined by the academy. I did a PhD, right? And the academy really creates the ego of the academic, right? The intellectual, individual, and academic. And again, discipline's discipline, and I was being disciplined by that. So I had to deal with that contradiction that I was part of organizing. And in this space, you're trying to build collectively. And then you're also being trained as an intellectual devoid of struggle. And you have to try to like deal with that contradiction of being part of organizing, but also creating yourself as a scholar, and trying to work through those contradictions, right? And for example, that piece I wrote about class suicide really was dealing with that contradiction of like, you have to be part of organizing. But I have to say that in 2016, I had kidney cancer. They removed my kidney, and I'm a cancer survivor. When I came out of that thing, I was like, man, criticize me all you want. If I'm wrong, that's fine. I'm still alive. I'll let me reassess my perspective, So I think dealing with a life and death situation really gave me a sense of humility, right? It really humbled me to be like, well, criticism is not that bad, right? And especially as the academic, if I'm at a community space and I'm stating a position and then the people are like, well, I don't know, we don't see it that way because what we're seeing on the ground is this. You need to listen to that criticism, that's important. So I think that for me personally, through my own experiences in organizing and the academy, that's a contradiction that I see that I have to confront on a daily. But again, my own life has really humbled me in that sense, to be more humble in that and to engage with criticism.
Well, man, we're so really glad that you're here with us and that you've made it through that, man. It's crazy. Going back to the, of course, I draw the straw to bring us back to this. So going back to the Hungarian rebellion for a second, another thing that Mao talks about is, he talks more about the impacts of this within China. It's kind of a theme that evolves through the essay. The reality that there were counter-revolutionaries that tried to seize upon this moment in revolutionary China. And this, of course, led to the repression of counter-revolutionaries, and then this leads to the difficult problem of how one accurately makes sure that they're really identifying who is an enemy of people, who were the counter-revolutionaries. And there's a part in the text where, he's really trying to grapple this of hey, some students might have gone off and done something crazy, but their kid, doesn't say their kids, but he's they probably can be, topped out of, kind of thing. So it's interesting because while Mao is quite clear that eliminating counter-revolutionaries is necessary, the correct task at that phase in the revolution, he's also quite open that there had been excesses and incorrect decisions that were made in this process, and so in other words, some people were branded as counter-revolutionaries that he recognizes actually that's not the case. And so it's an interesting piece because he calls for a thorough review of this to be done at the most local level possible, but including people from multiple levels of government and party. And the goal here seems to be admitting mistakes and seeking to right wrongs wherever they occurred. And he also notes that there are not, many counter-revolutionaries remaining in the country by his estimation. So I took this as him seeking to ensure people actually to not be in a constant state of paranoia that everybody around me that's doing something weird is a counter-revolutionary or overreacting to the threats that could be posed by them. So I was just curious about how if you had that same reflection, if you looked at it differently or what you thought of that section.
No, I think so. I think, going back to that point, right? Here he is a year later after the Soviet Union had to send in their tanks to quell a rebellion in Hungary. And he's like, I don't want that happening in China, right? We don't want to do that. And so how do we deal with potential counter-revolutionaries, which they had to deal with counter-revolutionaries and they continue to deal with counter-revolutionaries, right? This is, think about this again. This was only 8 years into the revolution. So they continue to have to deal with counter-revolutionary struggles. The U.S. had a whole bunch of blockades on them, and I'm sure the U.S. imperialism continued after that, right, against them. So, I think in this section that you're referring to, he's also referring to we need to be careful with the excesses because there have been. And so I think that's an important also a reflection there for us to think about because, in any revolutionary periods, we've seen that there's been excesses. You look at the Cuban Revolution, there was moments where they rectified. And same thing with the Chinese Revolution. They had to rectify these excesses, right? So I think it's really useful for us to see that there was a reflection and understanding that the excesses existed and that they had to be fleshed out, figured out, and worked through. right? That there wasn't like this romanticization that there was never any excesses. He's even saying it here, right? This is 1957, he's already saying, right? So to be, critiquing any communist movement, saying, oh, look, there was these problems. They even recognize them within the party. So yeah, okay, because that's the critique of like Cuba, of any socialist project, right? Oh, there's excesses. Well, yeah, that's what happens in the revolutionary struggle, especially when you have the biggest empire trying to destroy you, you know what I mean? So in this section, you have now talking about, well, let's work through that, make sure that we don't continue these excesses, right? And so I wanted to read this passage here, right? And he says on page 441, because he's addressing like, look, if anyone has ever had the perspective that we're not going to use excesses, it's the Marxists, right? He says, quote, Marxists have always held that the cause of the proletariat must depend on the masses of people, and that the communists must use the democratic method of persuasion and education where working among the laboring people, and must on no account resort to commandism or coercion, right? Again, commandism means forcing people or coercing, using actually repression, right? But again, if the people are the ones that are building society, why are you going to coerce them? You have to try to work through the forms of education and political education and persuasion, right? And he continues, in capitalist society, contradictions find expression in acute antagonisms and conflicts. In a sharp class struggle, they cannot be resolved by the capitalist system itself and can only be resolved by socialist revolution. The case is quite different with contradictions in socialist society. On the contrary, they're not antagonistic and can be ceaselessly resolved by the socialist system itself. So again, if you read Fidel Castro, he has a conversation with intellectuals and he's telling them the same thing, right? He's like, look, you guys could have your critiques, but it should be critiques to build socialism, not against socialism, because then we're going to see you as counter-revolution. Right? And this is what he's pretty much saying, right? That in capitalist society, there's acute contradictions that are antagonistic that can only be resolved through socialist revolution. But in a society that's building socialism, it's going to be solved through the socialist process, right? And so working through that to make sure that folks that are not necessarily counter-revolutionary have a space to air out their issues, their concerns that can be met through the socialist system, right? But I think, it's a useful piece here because even in our organizing, right, there's folks, that we're oftentimes thinking, are these folks, are they part of our org? Or someone sent them in? Like, you have to always be wary of this issue of counter-revolutionary folks, right? Folks are agents of the state, and so I think being careful and being wise to that is important in this section, right? And I think, again, which leads to the point of this essay, right? That he wanted his comrades to understand the importance of the difference between contradiction amongst the people and the enemy. Because he says, if you understand the difference in contradictions between the people and the enemy, clearly that'll prevent us from being clear who the counter-revolutionary is, right? Because if you have understanding of who the people is, you won't see them as counter-revolutionary. But he's like, because we don't have a clear understanding of that, we think anyone that's critiquing our society is counter-revolutionary. And they might not be counter-revolutionary. They might just have a legitimate criticism that we need to listen to, right? And so, I think that is an important section here, right? But, I think in this section, he continues to think about, then the start of the socialist revolution, the start of 49, there was many counter-revolutions. And I think this is the part where you're referring to, Jared, where he's like, at this moment, we don't have that many. Because he's saying, look, it was really rough at the start of it. But this is 8 years later, we've worked through that, and so we have to be clear that don't worry that we're not full of counter-revolutionaries yet. But I still think that there was still attempts, right? That there was a constant line struggle. Like I said, the line struggle was real in part. So there is still folks that were all about the capitalist road that they had to challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I think that specific one, I think in that section, in some ways, he's talking to the people to say, there's not counter-revolutionaries out everywhere amongst you. Calm down a little bit.
Yeah.
Like Billy shoots off the firework. It doesn't mean that this is Hungary.
Yeah, no, I think so, but I think the important point, and he mentions it in this piece, right? That counter-revolution will always exist as long as there's classes and class.
Yeah. I think the other thing I thought that was interesting about it, right, is obviously it's something that he's putting out to the party and to the people, and, it goes in the newspaper basically, but you think about it really, imagine if a United States president was hey, we think there's some excesses in all of these police shootings that are going on. We're actually going to do a review of every police shooting this year and bring members from the Democratic Party and the local government and, that would sound like, I think a lot of us at this point would be like, yeah, right. Like, we wouldn't, but like, it is a sort of fairly remarkable, I think, to have a leader be that open of like, no, actually, like you said earlier, like, we know that there's excesses in how folks are responding to this, but it also like gives you a sense too. It's like the folks that always sort of put all the terror on Stalin or all the terror on Mao in a revolutionary process, that these things are diffuse and there's a lot of different people involved. And it's like, a lot of times, I mean, not always, but like in many cases, it's not like the top is saying like, go out and just go crazy with this, right? Like repress everybody, attack. Like that a lot of times they're actually the ones trying to sort of reel people in and say like, okay, like we want to make sure that understand that most of us are actually on the same team at this point. Like we have our disagreements, but we can work through them in, like you said, non-antagonistically, so.
Yeah. No, and to your point, right? Think about that. This was published in the People's Daily, right? Like in People's newspaper, right? Could you imagine leaders releasing a discourse like this and engaging it and wanting people to engage it, right? And more so that there was a campaign for literacy in China, right? Before the revolution, there was a large population that was illiterate. And here you have a moment where they created a literacy campaign. They got everyone on a level where they could read this. Right? We have folks now that are trying to read this. Like, oh, I don't get it. Well, think about it. Back in China, they were reading this. They were engaging this. And I think that's pretty powerful, right? To think about a leader releasing this and having people engage it and really where you work through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that Mao talks about in this essay is the sort of the unpredictability of history and how bad things can lead to good things. Use the term like how victory can be snatched from defeat and vice versa. And he talks about examples of this. He talks about how World War I led to the revolution in the USSR. He talks about how World War II led to the rise of the socialist bloc, and acknowledges that even a third world war could ultimately lead to the defeat of the imperialist camp. He does add a word of caution, though, that, quote, it is the conditions which are essential, end quote, adding that without the given conditions, neither of the two contradictory aspects can transform itself into its opposite, end quote. And I wonder if you could say a bit about this. It certainly is a dialectical materialist formulation, but often there's a criticism of Marxism that it espouses a framework of inevitability. People will say this sometimes, thinking about sort of like the Communist Manifesto, right? And the way that it's like very like stages in certain points, or can be read that way. As the world proceeds progressively from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, and that this is ultimately an inevitable process. In my reading, Mao here seems to be arguing differently than that specific interpretation of that process, which saying that A, sometimes victory can occur when defeat seems most likely, B, that we don't know how things will proceed, and C, that objective and subjective conditions are key determinants in the final outcome. So I'm curious how you read this piece and kind of what you think about that, and think about Mao maybe around this idea of inevitability and also like contingency or whatever.
I agree. I agree with your reading of it, right? I think, this critique of Marxism as being that, right? Like almost like the Bible, right? That there's like a story that, but I think for me, the Marx method teaches us that the only constant is change, right? Things are constantly changing. There's the contradiction brings change. And for me, that he brings that in there's this in the section titled "The Question of Agricultural Cooperation." Mao reminds his comrades, right? And I quote, "It is clear that it takes hard struggle to build up cooperatives. New things always have to experience difficulties and setbacks as they grow. It is sheer fantasy to imagine that the cause of socialism is all plain sailing and easy success, without difficulties and setbacks or the exertion of tremendous effort." And for me, that section, he's kind of referring back to what you're saying, right? That things need to be built, need to be struggled through, and that conditions, had to be set up, but that thing that, it's not going to happen, right? It's not inevitable, right? So for me, I think that critique of Marxism being that is kind of like, and I come across it a lot, I'm in a sociology department. So I have students that, have taken an introductory sociology course and they learn Marx, and that's how they tell me, oh, Marxism is pretty much saying that there's this, and this, right? Oh, it's capitalism, socialism, communism. That's it. I'm like, no, that's sociology, Marxism, I guess, right? But if you actually see it in struggle, that's not the case, right? This goes back to Marxist thinkers. Think about Gramsci, right? Gramsci was truly engaged in this issue, right? He's like, we didn't have revolution in Italy. We had fascism. And he's like, why? And the struggle over hegemony, common sense, right? And dealing with that issue, right? You have Althusser talk about the ideological state apparatus. So I think this discussion that you're saying is clear, what you're saying about what Mao's saying. I think that, Marxists have always warned us that there's no guarantee in social struggle. I think that's an important point too. There's a essay by Stuart Hall that's like Marxism without guarantees, right? That's like, there is no guarantee that this will produce, right? So I think for me, there's a really good interpretation where it's like, instead of saying the situation in the last instance, like in the first instance, capitalism sets up the conditions and it's up for us to struggle against them, right? It's not a closed system. It's an open system. And for us, the same thing with Marxism. Marxism it's a theory of analyzing society. And it's about using Marxism to apply it to concrete conditions, right, in different places. That's why when you read Latin American Marxists, they have a different context of understanding Marxism. Same thing with African Marxists in Africa, right? And so I think that's an important reflection that Mao was offering, right? That I don't think, unfortunately, it's a cheap shot to Marxism to me when they say that that's, what you were just said, that kind of teleological critique.
Yeah, I agree, but it always comes up. So it's I think it's good to address when we see examples that are counter to it, so that demonstrate for folks that actually there's a lot of even in Marx, like a lot of his work is that way. Like it's not like like I will say, we talked to China Mielville last year on the manifesto, and like one of the things he says about it is like, he's like, you have to read it as like an exhortation. He's like, it's a manifesto. It's trying to will something. It's trying to give people something to lift their spirits and to like, he said it actually comes out of a religious tradition, the manifesto does, of like, it's a pamphlet, right? To get folks fired up about something, basically.
That's exactly what I was saying. It was a pamphlet. It was trying to get people to inspire people to fight, right? And so it's like, it's going to have a little bit of exaggeration there.
Yeah,
that's different from the analysis of capital, for example, right? Yeah. Or even when you're reading like the Civil War in France or the 18th Brumaire, right? He's showing you that it's different parts, different stages of writing, different styles of writing. And it's like, and then you'll see that in Mao. Right?
It's like the pregame or the halftime speech, right? It's like
exactly, right? Exactly, right? So it's like, I think you have to read that and put that in the context. But anyone that is going to critique Marx and Marxism on that and will critique it for anything, right? So I think that's fine if you want to continue with that, but we'll just continue with our work, right? We'll continue doing what we're doing. And I think that's important.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. That I think it kind of reminds me of something I've been thinking about for a while now, just so with regard to, for one, I've come to realize that people have an obsession with labeling with a tendency, if that makes sense. And there's like a hyper obsession with it to the point of like, and oftentimes this identification largely rests on who they historically sided with, like to say, like you identify as a Trotskyist, right? Because you side with Trotsky over Stalin. It's like, these people are, okay, first of all, these people are like, they're dead, for one, right? Like, no disrespect, but like, that's the case, right? But instead of that, right, I always think that like, identifying with these things should be grounded in like, how can we make this applicable to our current specific situation? And I think that's what Mao was doing, right? I think that's what Maoism is. And that's how I always describe it to people, right? It was like specific to Chinese society. That's not saying that you can't, poke and prod and pull things from it and study it, right? Because there are things about it that is relevant. And I've read Mao years ago and it's still studying his works. And there's a lot that we can take from it, of course. But I always find that interesting. And I remember asking someone that question, someone who's a Trotskyist in particular, asking like, how do you see Trotskyism like being relevant here in the U.S., right? And like I remember like listening to this person for about 30 minutes, like just scrambling for an answer and not knowing who, like, how to answer that question. And I think that was fascinating to me, and I think that's why I see that now, even with like Maoists, quote unquote Western Maoists, in the sense as well. So I'm very curious of what you think, Jay, as well. I'm really interested in what you both think about this. But yeah.
Yeah, I think listening to you, it's interesting to say that, right? Because again, like people calling, like, in that moment, in this piece, right? Again, this is right before that split, right? That split that between the Soviet Union and China, and that created all kinds of struggles, right? All kinds of tensions, all kinds of contradictions, and issues that the Soviet Union did and China did eventually that just, if now with the historical lens, it's like, damn, that's fucked up. You guys did that, right? So it's like on the Soviet Union and China, right? But reading, learning from those lessons and looking at this piece for me, and I think going back to what you said about like, how do we apply, for example, if we read this as a Maoist text, how do you apply this Maoist text today, right? Even although this piece was written in 1957 in China, what are some lessons that we could pull out of this text today? Right? And for me, those lessons are, how do you engage the masses, the people that are not antagonistic in a way that is non-antagonistic, a way that how do you organize pretty much, right? How do you organize in a way that you are actually building your base, right? And what I'm learning from this is like, you don't do it in an antagonistic way. And unfortunately, what I see oftentimes in organizing, it becomes very antagonistic, right? Where you're out there propping your perspective, your line, and you're doing it in a way that becomes antagonistic to someone that doesn't have your line, right? Rather than find a unity, again, principled unity, right? And build from there. Right? Again, unity, criticism, unity, right? Instead, it's criticism, no unity, criticism. It's like, and so to me, this piece, offers that. Because, we're just touching the surface of it in this session, because there's so many sections that he goes that we could unpack for correct or incorrect ways of dealing with things today. But again, I think at the essence of it, is like, how do we engage with everyday people? Which is the mass. As an academic myself, as a member of a community, as a part of an organization, as a member of a cadre, as a member of a political formation developing a party, how are you going to engage folks that might have a different view, might have even a reactionary view, but are not antagonistic, just have a reactionary view because that's what the dominant society has told them to have, but are not ideologically like positioned, are not part of the Proud Boys, but are just like, well, America's cool, I celebrate 4th of July. Okay, well, let's talk about that. I think to me, this piece is offering some lessons.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I also think like there's like different, certainly in the United States, like there's different eras at which different sort of strains of Marxism had a lot of like currency too, or there's different groups of people through which they have currency because of struggles that they're involved in too. And like even like with Trotskyism, for a long time it was sort of, I won't say it's the only, but like there was a lot of Trotskyism in the United States, partly because he came here, right, and he like was in Mexico, and it was just like he had connections with a lot of folks like CLR James and all those other folks, and so like there's also often like lineages and genealogies of like how people get politicized, right, and then like you may or may not agree. I think Twitter is like and this is not to do what I did the other day and just like dunk on it for the fact that it's Twitter, but it does produce a certain type of social interaction inherently, because it is kind of all about, I shouldn't say it's not all about, but it promotes a behavior of just bickering basically over disagreements and like trying to come out on top or whatever. And so like I think that in itself like gets away from something like, you very rarely see people express unity, that unity element with each other on Twitter, even if they have a lot of actually overall agreement. It's all about what those differences are.
Yeah. I go back to that quote I brought up earlier, right? In capitalist society, contradictions find expression in acute antagonisms and conflicts with sharp class struggle. And even that'll find itself on Twitter. Because again, it's part of capitalist society. So how we engage each other on social media is not respectively and principally, right? Because we're not in a new society. We're not using social media in a new society where we're trying to develop a new society. We're in a capitalist society where it's dog-eat-dog world, right? And so like, you're going to see that as an expression in social media, unfortunately. Right? Even within spaces that are unfortunately on the left, right? That we might see as political organizations, unless, again, you're really trying to have a principled perspective. And that takes work. That takes reflection, self-reflection as an organization and as a person. But it's hard in this neoliberal society. It's so individual. Not impossible.
For sure. Sure. Absolutely. I appreciate you both for that. Yeah. Some other major focuses of this essay are the economy, industry, our agriculture, and cooperatives. Mao is quite clear that China lacks experience in all these matters and is proceeding from a point of being a very impoverished country. He also preaches patience with the models and plans and talks about the assistance and experience of socialist countries, primarily the Soviet Union, while still cautioning to avoid dogmatic application of their approaches. So are there any important lessons or questions raised by these sections for you?
I think, again, this is right before the Sino-Soviet split, right? Which is important for us to learn and study. I think definitely, we just talk about Trotskyism, we talk about, Maoism and Marxist-Leninism. I think, I always tell that to my students, right? When you use the word the left, there's so many things that you mean when you say the left. Don't think the left is the Democratic Party. You know what I mean? Like I tell my students that all the time, because when they hear the left in the mainstream, the left is the Democrats. And it's like, nah, dude. I try to get them to think about it, that there's so much more, and this essay, again, this is right before that split. And so I do encourage folks to really learn about this. What was the split? Why? I think you have a whole episode, But I think this idea of dogmatism is really important for Mao, right? Because he really was about making sure that you would try to understand the concrete conditions of China. And just like you were saying, Josh, right, that this is a text from China. And he was writing about the Chinese condition, the Chinese situation. And so he eventually wrote essays about critiques of the Soviet economy and the critiques of Stalin. But from a principled position. It wasn't the critiques from the US of Stalin, but critiques of where did Stalin go wrong, where did Stalin go correct, and how do we build from that, right? And I see that in this section. But, thinking about, you're asking me if there's other important lessons or questions from this section that I think were important. He has a section titled The Question of Industrialists and Merchants. Because again, socialist society, the construction, they didn't get rid of all the bourgeoisie. They had the national bourgeoisie. They're like, oh, we still need your industry. We still need your know-how. We still need your engineers. We need to build this thing, right? But he talks about this passage that I think is really important. He's like, everybody needs remolding. The exploiters and also the working people. It is not a given that the revolution changes consciousness. It has to be struggle. So I think Mao talks about this in his own process of remolding through study and then through struggle. Even in this essay, he talks about himself. Like, look, I had to go through a process of remolding, and I'm still remolding. And that, to me, again, talking about what you were saying earlier on, Jay, here's this leader of a party saying, look, I'm remolding. Y'all need to be remolding. But also focusing on, look, these exploiters need to be remolded, right? These owners of these businesses need to be remolded. We need to be on top of them to remold. And if they don't, they're reactionary, right? Because eventually they're counter-revolutionary. But then he emphasized, but so do working people. The class that's leading this revolution has to be remolded as well, right? Because again, they have this feudal baggage, the feudal relations still existed. The hierarchies of men over women still existed that had to be eliminated, right? The treatment of children, right? The treatment of this hierarchy of children and the rights of children had to be respected. And so I think those things, again, that remolding process is something I really found useful and for today, right? To think about this idea of remolding, which is, again, is really hard to do in a capitalist society, right? Because here you're remolding to become a neoliberal subject, not a socialist subject. And so this is kind of tied to the idea of remolding. To me, is kind of tied to the idea of class suicide, right? But for Mao, it's broader. It's not just the petty bourgeois needs to have class suicide. He's even talking about the working class remold. Like, that they are a class, that they have to build that class consciousness, but also remold to be, have a socialist understanding of the world, right? To build that international proletariat. And was it something that says it wasn't a given? So I think that was something important that I found useful here. But another part that I think was important, the idea of how Marxists should not be afraid of criticism, right? There's a section that he talks about, like, as Marxists, you should not be afraid of criticism. And he says, and I quote this, quite the contrary. They need to temper and develop themselves and win new positions in the teeth of criticism and the storm and stress of struggle. Fighting against wrong ideas is like being vaccinated. A man develops greater immunity from disease and a result of vaccination. To me, again, that's important. Again, I think what I mentioned earlier, my experience with cancer, like that really taught me that, right? It's like, I survived this thing. Criticism is not a problem. So if whoever listens to this podcast and thinks I'm incorrect, that's cool. You could tell me that and I'll figure out why I'm incorrect. You know what I mean? But I think this idea of Marxism, being that it should be open to criticism, because that's what Marxism is. It's a science of criticism, and itself should be criticized, right? I think that is a powerful view of this perspective, right?
Yeah. So are there any other aspects of this piece that we didn't touch on that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, there's a section called The Question of the Intellectual. And I think that's an important section, considering that I see myself part of that strata as petty B intellectual. And so I think it applies to this current. So the quote that I wanted to point is that they, meaning the intellectuals, they must continue to remold themselves gradually, shed their bourgeois world outlook, and acquire the proletarian communist world outlook so that they can fully fit in with the needs of the new society and unite with the workers and the peasants. You know, again, in academia, what are we learning? We're learning a bourgeois outlook. The social sciences, the humanities in the US is a bourgeois institution. That we learn Marxism in these institutions, some of us. Yes, we might learn them, but again, like I mentioned earlier, you might learn sociology, Marxism. You're not learning Marxism from a party. You're not learning Marxism from an organization. You're learning, as you were saying earlier, Jay, before we started, right, about like just constant critique, but never really finding like why you're critiquing or what are you building, right? You're just kind of like this like, critique for the sake of critique. And I don't think that's not what Mao's saying here. Criticism, unity is not about just critique for the sake of critique. It's to build and to unite, right? And I think for the intellectuals or the academics, I guess, for a better word, is how do we shed this bourgeois world outlook under these conditions? How do we, for me, it's always been about how do you engage in organizing, and again, I'm not saying you got to be the fucking front and center organizer, but how do you work with organizers? How do you build with people on the ground? And how do you learn from them and listen to them and not just study them or do an ethnography of them, which is, again, that's your research. I get it. But also, like, how do you not just do that, but actually build with them, learn with them, right? And that's the part where he's saying, right? He's like, uniting with the workers and the peasants. In the development of socialist construction in China, the worker-peasant alliance was the primary class alliance, right? That was building socialism in China. And so for him, the intellectuals that were already there prior to the revolution had to either remold and recognize that this is the new route that they're taking, and they had to like start reading some Marxism and engaging and actually doing productive work, production on the ground, and getting their hands dirty, or are they going to be counter-revolutionary? And again, there's an essay by Fidel Castro that he has the same issue, that he has a discussion with intellectuals, right? So I think every revolution confronts this, that you have intellectuals that were influenced by Western academia, and have this enlightened view that they're enlightened more than the workers or the peasants. And here you have Mao saying that we need to work with these, because he also recognizes the value and the importance of intellectual work and intellectual production. But he's like, but it has to be for the betterment of socialism, not against socialism, right? You read Wretched of the Earth. What is Fanon saying? He's saying the very similar thing, right? You read Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney. You have also many folks that are writing about this and really thinking about the role of the intellectual. And I think this section is really important. He has another part where he says, both students and intellectuals should study hard. In addition to the study of their specialized subjects, they must make progress ideologically and politically, which means they should study Marxism, current events, and politics. Not to have a correct political orientation is like not having a soul. It's just, again, it's like the idea of like, what is your correct political orientation for intellectuals? That's an important question for us to ask. Are we for the people or are we for the enemy? As simplistic as that may sound, it's a real question.
Yeah, I'd comment on the critical nature of academia. I grabbed the undercommons and I went to a section, because there's a whole section where they go into the university and the undercommons, and they talk about that, like about how, like, they say the critical academic questions, the university questions, the state questions, art, politics, culture, but in the undercommons it is no questions asked. And so they go back and forth on this whole thing, but they talk about how basically, like, to be critical of the university for an academic is, they say, is like par excellence. Like, it's like they're like playing with it and joking, but like the point, being that like that is, you're rewarded for being critical. It's not bad in itself to be critical. There's lots of things to be critical of. We need critical thinking, but it's missing the whole the whole unity part. The whole like it's missing the whole, and it's missing the party. It's missing like the collective project. And so it's just like criticism for the sake of criticism.
Yeah, and it's individualized, right? It's individualized and not seen as part of a larger struggle. So I think that's something you see here. And I think for another part to me that's important is the section around national minorities, right? He's talking about like these different nationalities that exist in China, and he's like, we first have to confront Han's chauvinism. So it's like national chauvinism that needs to be deconstructed, but also local nationalism. And he's like, how do we, we're building socialism for everybody. How do we unite these different nationalities? And I think to me that's an important section to read, even when we think about identity politics and these different moments in the United States, right? And me myself being Salvadoran Mexican, how do I make sure that my Salvadoran brothers and sisters and the Mexicans are in solidarity with each other, rather than confronting each other in LA, right? I think that's an important conversation to have, right? How do we fight national chauvinism within our organized space? That's an important, I think, reflection.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think so. And I feel like a lot of people are starting to get to a place where they're more ready for that conversation than they were a couple of years ago. It seems to me, I hear more people kind of getting comfortable talking about those issues in a way where I think for a while people were even like afraid to confront some of the very identitarian, stuff that was going on, because it was so prominent for a while there, or felt like that for folks of left politics, I think.
And, again, I go back to the position, like, what's the democratic method in dealing with folks that might have these identitary views? Like, I think people that I come across and we're trying to organize, their first stage of consciousness was their identity, right? And that's where they're at. And it's like, do I knock them for that, or do I build from that? And I think that's the question here, right? And I think for me, it's you build, unless obviously they're siding with the Democratic Party and they're ideologically bent on that's the solution. No, but for most folks, that's not it. It's like, that's where you start, like I could think of my own upbringing, my first reflection, what Fanon says, you're rich because you're white and you're white because you're rich. Growing up, I'm brown, and my reflection is I'm poor because I'm brown. But that also was a class analysis that I wasn't recognizing at that, right? But my first consciousness was, well, I'm a brown kid in LA. I'm poor, But again, that had to be built. I had folks luckily around me that raised that level of analysis. And I think for us, this section for me really taught me pushing that. Like, how do we raise the analysis for the folks that might have these contending views, And many do. And I think that's the thing, right? That I think this piece is, again, how do we do that mass organizing? And that's what he's advocating, his cadres and his party members. Dude, we have to continue doing this organizing, even though we won the revolution. We have to continue. Organizing has to continue under socialist construction.
Right on. Well, thanks again. While we have you here, is there anything else that you want to say before you go? I do want to shout out, I know that you're working on a forthcoming journal, I believe, hopefully with Foreign Languages Press. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that or any other, efforts or things you're involved in.
For sure. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Foreign Languages Press. I think it's an amazing, it's a Marxist-Leninist publishing house that was founded in 2016. They publish many classic, current texts in Marxist-Leninist and Maoist tradition. But I really recommend folks to look them up. I think they provide, really, really cheap prices for the books that sell. But more importantly, they also provide the PDFs. So for folks that are interested in Marxist literature, check out that page. And there's so much that they have there. This piece on the correct handling of contradictions amongst the people, they have multiple volumes of Mao's work, right? But beyond him, they have stuff on Lenin, Mao, right? Marx and Engels, right? So I definitely recommend them. But they're developing the end of this year, FLP is developing a MLM journal for contending school of revolutionary thought named Material. And I've been invited to be part of the advisory committee for this journal. So it should be coming out this upcoming at the end of the year. So I'm really excited about that. And it's just exciting who I'm part of that advisory committee with. I'm very honored to be part of it. But I also I would like to get in that I'm part of. Again, I mentioned earlier that I was part of the solidarity movement with the people's struggle in the Philippines. I'd like folks to check out the grassroots efforts of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, the Malaya Movement, and the Kapatan Alliance here in the U.S., as they organize to bring attention to the grave human rights violations and repression of people's movements in the Philippines. Currently, these coalitions and partner organizations are demanding that the U.S. pass the Philippine Human Rights Act, which seeks to end U.S. military aid to the Philippines. I believe international solidarity is our duty in the belly of the beast. So please check out the humanrightsph.org, humanrightsph.org. Right? These organizations do a lot of important mass work around the U.S., so I really recommend y'all check them out. And I think we need to be aware of the people's struggles abroad, right? Not only here in the U.S., but abroad, in the Philippines, in Mexico, and El Salvador, in India. Right? There's mass movements happening that we need to learn from and build from.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make sure to plug that, put that in the show notes and everything like that, so folks can just click the link after they listen to this. So yeah, thanks again, man. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. This was great
Too.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Bye.